All right, well, we are back to some more biology. I want to talk about three. I want to talk about three hypotheses that exist in the literature, psychophysiological theories of exercise dependence. Psychophysiological, you should know what that means from the beginning of the semester, so I want you to kind of take yourself back. I want to go back. Take yourself back to the early part of the semester when we talked about psychosomatic and psychophysiological and what psychophysiological means. These are psychophysiological theories of exercise dependence. There's some research to support them, some more than others, but I want you to understand what the top three theories of exercise dependence are, psychophysiological theories in nature. We have the B endorphin, the B beta endorphin hypothesis, the sympathetic arousal hypothesis, and the affect regulation hypothesis. So picking up on what I said on the prior biology discussion a number of slides back about endorphins, the most significant psychophysiological explanations of exercise dependence include the beta endorphin hypothesis. So what is this about? The idea is that exercise, as I said on a previous video, causes the release of our endogenous, meaning they're made in our own brains, our endogenous pain-killing chemicals, our endogenous opioids during exercise. This inhibits pain, our perception of pain, and it improves our mood state, right? And, you think about like when you're working out, you can often work out and not even feel muscle soreness or even a pull until way later. And the argument is that's because of endorphins, that they're muting your pain perception and they're increasing your feeling of happiness until you can continue. Now, the hypothesis really doesn't have extremely strong support in humans. A lot of it is done with animals. For all the reasons I mentioned before, particularly rats and mice, but preliminary evidence indicates that the reason that this happens is the exercise is impacting certain systems in our brain. It's causing the release of endorphins. It's impacting our endocannabinoid system in the brain as well. A lot of this relates to the idea of a so-called runner's high. Now take a moment. When have you heard endocannabinoid system before? What was I talking about in our addiction unit that had to do with endocannabinoids? Does anybody remember? I'll give you a hint. Food, munchies. Remember I talked in our food addiction lectures about why people get the munchies when they eat certain kinds of foods, why certain kinds of foods make them even hungrier. Also, what else did I talk about? In drug addiction and sugar and cocaine, right? I talked about endocannabinoids. And I talked about the fact that the endocannabinoid system is impacted by the THC in marijuana. And certain foods, like sugary foods especially, also impact the endocannabinoid system and why people want to go back and eat those foods again. Preliminary research and some research with animals, as was the case with sugar and cocaine that we talked about, impacts the endocannabinoid system, and that leads to people feeling a sense of high, just like they do with marijuana and just like sugar. And so the idea is people with exercise dependence may continue to exercise to increase activation of that system and get that feeling of euphoria and reduced pain. All right, moving on to the sympathetic arousal hypothesis. This one, now you should know, sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. You guys know what this system does, right? You know a lot about the sympathetic nervous system because when we have our fight or flight response during stress, that's the system that we engage. So the sympathetic arousal hypothesis suggests that engaging in regular exercise results in feelings of a kind of what's called a training effect, where people will adapt to consistent aerobic activity. Because over time, as your body desensitizes and adapts and you develop even endurance, you're not going to get the same level of sympathetic nervous system arousal as you did before. And so the idea is that people might need to increase their levels of exercise activity, leading to eventual dependence, because they need higher intensities of exercise to get the same activation of their sympathetic nervous system. And in fact, they argue that at rest, people who have been accustomed to more aerobic activity actually feel very decreased levels of sympathetic nervous system at rest, almost lethargic. And so to combat those levels of lethargy, they have to go back to even more frequent and higher intensity aerobic activity to stimulate their sympathetic nervous system, heart rate, breathing rate, blood pressure, etc., to feel more alert and more awake. This makes sense to some degree, because people who are in great aerobic shape, like runners, if they get their pulse taken at rest, it's extremely low. Now, on the one hand, this is evidence that your cardiovascular system is working very well. So in other words, at rest, when you're not challenging the system, your heart is not working that hard. It's easily functioning, oxygen's getting to your muscles. But the idea is that ironically, this level of fitness creates almost a feeling of lethargy at baseline. And so in order to get back that feeling of arousal, people go back to more frequent exercise at higher levels of intensity. A lot of this is speculative, I have to say. There's not a ton of research about this. This is very, very much speculative at the present time. And then finally, we have what is referred to as the affect regulation hypothesis. So just affect regulation should tell you that this is about, in some way, managing mood states, affect mood, right? Here, the idea is that exercise increases positive affect and decreases negative affect. And the dual effect of exercise on mood state will lead people to use it as a means to cope with stress. And because it's such an effective way of doing so, it becomes the primary exclusive way eventually of controlling mood. So for people with exercise dependence, they start to experience improvements in mood as they exercise, and then they become more dependent on it to regulate their mood state, to create feelings of happiness, and to remove feelings of dysphoria, depression, anger, anxiety, etc. And so the idea is that, once people realize that exercise does alleviate their negative moods and create positive moods, it becomes aligned with a way to best regulate their moods. And so it contributes to an overall better mood state, this sort of more prolonged psychological feeling that for several hours or even days follows exercise. And then it becomes a way for people to effectively and efficiently, from their perspective, regulate their mood. And then you might be thinking, well, what's wrong with that, right? What's wrong with using something healthy like exercise to regulate mood? Done in moderation, nothing. But the idea is, if it becomes your exclusive way of managing mood states, it could lead to not only physical consequences and also some of the other consequences of exercise dependence we talked about, but it could also cause people to not deal with any of the reasons they're experiencing those mood states, such as problems in their relationships, problems at work, etc. And then they're avoiding things rather than dealing with them, and using exercise just the way people use drugs and alcohol, for example, or food or sex, to avoid dealing with the source of the negative emotionality. They're just using emotion-focused coping, right? You know what that means. And they're just trying to regulate the mood state and eradicate the negative moods rather than deal with why they have them in the first place. The idea here too is that the exercise becomes a way to provide kind of relief, right, from uncomfortable mood states. It's not just that people aren't dealing with the source of those mood states, they're not even letting themselves feel them. And sometimes we learn and grow through negative mood, right? Because we reflect, well, why do I feel this way? But you're not going to reflect if you're just trying to get rid of it all the time. And the idea here is that, you know, after prolonged periods of abstaining from exercise, once people start to rely on it to regulate their mood, the negative affective states really create almost a sense of withdrawal symptoms. And the only way they can alleviate that withdrawal is through further exercise. And so the cycle sort of continues, right? It's they don't want to deal with the withdrawal effect, which is typically the negative mood state, the depression, the anxiety, the irritability, because they were using their exercise exclusively to alleviate that. If they don't exercise, they have all these negative emotions to deal with. That's not comfortable. So they want to inevitably go back to exercise more frequently and more intensely to try to ward off those mood states. And again, in and of itself, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're using exercise exclusively to avoid feeling a certain way, but you're not dealing with why you feel that way, you're doing emotion-focused coping, not problem-focused coping, and you're not eradicating the source of your negative emotionality, you're just avoiding it. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. We are almost done with today's class, and I'm going to meet you on slide number 17.